Welcome to Biographics. I'm your co-host, Eric Malachite, cosmic horror author, crazy person, and production manager behind the scenes here. Today's script was written by James CJ. If they've provided socials, go give them a follow as they'll be linked alongside my own. With that said, go ahead and like, subscribe, comment down below, and get ready to learn about Kurt Vonnegut, the misunderstood writer. The 20th century saw many American authors leave their mark on the world of American literature. One such author to succeed in leaving such a mark was Kurt Vonnegut. Kurt Vonnegut is a hard writer to pin down, with a career spanning over 5 decades. He was prolific throughout his illustrious career, writing books that attempted to dissect not only his life, but to understand the world he'd grown up in. As a writer, Vonnegut often approached his subject matter with satire and science fiction twists, making his work unique and sometimes challenging to decipher. 3 general concepts guided much of his work: social equality, pacifism, and common decency. Overshadowed by his most popular book, Slaughterhouse-Five, Kurt Vonnegut's interesting life helps make sense of his exciting work throughout his career. This is the story of the misunderstood writer, Kurt Vonnegut. On November 11th, 1922, in Indianapolis, Indiana, Kurt and Edith Vonnegut welcomed their 3rd child into the world, Kurt Vonnegut Jr. The history of the Vonnegut family in America began in the mid-1800s when his great-grandfather left Germany for the US. There, the family started the Vonnegut Hardware Company in 1852. Edith Vonnegut had a prosperous family of her own, the Liebers. Thanks to a highly successful brewery, her family was one of the wealthiest in the state. While his parents hoped to pass their German heritage onto their children, the outbreak of World War I changed everything. They were forced to abandon their heritage for patriotism, and out of fear that people would turn against them. This resulted in Kurt and his siblings growing up ignorant of their heritage and, in a sense, without roots. Despite their sacrifices to survive a dark period in history, things were about to get much worse for the family who, at the time, had it all. With the dawn of Prohibition in 1920, the Liebers Brewery shuttered its doors. Financial woes compounded when the Great Depression started in 1929, and Kurt Sr. began seeing a decline in people needing the services of a once prolific architect. The Great Depression hit everyone in America, and the Vonneguts were no exception. Their financial security, social standing, and prosperity evaporated within a few short years. While Kurt Jr.'s siblings remained in private school, Kurt was forced into public school. Much of Vonnegut's skepticism and hatred towards certain American ideals were shaped by a negative experience growing up during the 1930s, calling himself a child of the Great Depression. Kurt Jr. wasn't the only one suffering, though. His parents had been fighting to keep things afloat, but his mother noticeably made more effort to provide. Vonnegut saw firsthand that his father withdrew from the fight and became less financially and emotionally dependable. Then Edith fell into a depression of her own as she became withdrawn, but also bitter and, at times, abusive. Her former life of status had made her fight for that life yet again in a climate that simply didn't allow for such things. Kurt could see the change in their relationship, with Kurt going as far as to say she developed a pure hatred of his father. The year was 1936 when Kurt Vonnegut went to Shortridge High School. Here, he'd get the first taste of what his life would become when he joined the Shortridge Echo, the school newspaper, becoming the co-editor. His time at the Shortridge Echo proved beneficial for Vonnegut, as that's when he noticed his natural talent for writing. He enjoyed writing for a large built-in audience of students at Shortridge, and eventually when he went to college, he would take this with him, even if it wasn't what he ended up studying. In 1940, fresh off high school graduation, Vonnegut enrolled at the Ivy League school Cornell in New York. At first, he intended to study architecture or humanities like his father. However, his brother Bernard and his father were against his choices, telling him to go for something more practical. This resulted in the strange choice of biochemistry, which was well outside Vonnegut's wheelhouse and something he'd end up loathing. However, his choice in major really didn't matter much, as he wasn't interested in his studies at all. Instead, he devoted much of his attention and energy to the Cornell Daily Sun, which, as you likely guessed, is the university's newspaper, as a writer and later editor. Vonnegut's time at the Cornell Daily Sun gave early readers a glimpse into his mind. As World War II raged on in Europe, it was becoming clearer by the day that eventually the US would enter the war itself. Vonnegut knew this, but his strong sense of pacifism meant he was against the idea of war, which showed in his work for the Cornell Daily Sun. This would become an ongoing theme in his later works and the core identity of his biggest hit and claim to fame. For now, war was afoot, and not even Kurt Vonnegut Jr. could outrun the inevitable. As the US was pulled into World War II, Kurt Vonnegut was fortunate enough to be a part of the Reserve Officers Training Corps, or ROTC. However, this would quickly change when Vonnegut found himself on academic probation in May of 1942, due to his slipping grades and a satirical, yet critical article in the Cornell Daily Sun. The article, which was about the pending war effort and openly mocked the ROTC, was enough to get him in trouble with the school and the officials running the ROTC. By 1943, Kurt Vonnegut had no choice but to drop out, which meant conscription into the US Army. He didn't wait to be drafted and instead enlisted in March, leaving immediately for Fort Bragg in North Carolina. Once he arrived, he began training to maintain and fire howitzers. He also received training in mechanical engineering at both Carnegie and at the University of Tennessee. This was part of the Army Specialized Training Program, ASTP, which was canceled in 1944 as D-Day approached and the need for soldiers grew stronger. So Vonnegut left for Camp Atterbury in Edinburgh, Indiana. One dark day, long before he'd be sent to Europe, Vonnegut returned home for Mother's Day to find his mother had taken her own life. It was always speculated that the loss of the family's wealth and status, her failure to find success as a writer, and Kurt Jr.'s deployment were the core factors that drove her to suicide. 3 months after this tragedy, Vonnegut would be sent to Europe as part of the 106th Infantry Division as an intelligence scout. This was it. Vonnegut was heading to the battlefield. Like most soldiers in World War II, Vonnegut's time on the battlefield was far from pleasant. In 1944, instead of spending the holiday season at home, he was fighting in the Battle of the Bulge, considered the final German offensive of the war. Despite their inexperience, his infantry reached the front and was assigned to St. Vith, a quieter sector. However, on December 22, 1944, Vonnegut was captured along with 50 American soldiers by German forces. Kurt and the other soldiers were transported to South Dresden in Saxony, Germany, via boxcar, where they'd remain in a prison camp. He was almost killed by the Royal Air Force, who attacked the transport trains, resulting in 150 Allied casualties, unbeknownst to them. Vonnegut and other POWs lived in a slaughterhouse in Dresden and worked in a malt syrup factory. He'd later expressed that Dresden was the first fancy city he'd ever seen, and also one that Germany had low expectations would be hit by Allied forces, seeing as there were few bomb shelters and no industries of war. Eventually, Dresden would find itself a target, and starting on February 13, 1945, they began firebombing the city. After a few days, the offensive subsided, leaving Dresden all but destroyed and 25,000 civilian casualties. The vast majority of the POWs were put to work retrieving bodies from the rubble. Not long after the attack on Dresden, the Red Army liberated Vonnegut and fellow POWs, who proceeded to leave the city on foot to the Saxony border to be reunited with Allied forces, who'd recently captured Leipzig, the largest city in Saxony. With the help of the Soviets, he reached the POW repatriation camp in Le Havre, France, by the end of May 1945. Following his freedom, he returned home to the US. He worked at Fort Riley, Kansas in an administration role, helping to type discharge papers for other soldiers. He was awarded a Purple Heart for his service, though not that he actually cared for it. Following his service, he was discharged and returned home to Indianapolis to start truly living his life post-war. Kurt Vonnegut wasted no time living his life following his service. Before leaving the army entirely, he married his high school girlfriend, Jane Marie Cox, whom he'd known since kindergarten. So on September 1st, 1945, at 22, the two made it official. After his service, it was clear that he'd outgrown Indianapolis. He left for Chicago with his new bride and enrolled at the University of Chicago, studying anthropology. This was primarily thanks to the provisions in the GI Bill, which provided financial aid to those who wanted to attend college after their service. While studying, he worked as a reporter at the City News Bureau of Chicago at night. Kurt was also writing creatively at this time, mainly short stories, but they were all meeting the same fate: rejection, which I have known the pain of. Yeah, that's painful. But it gets better. Eventually, you will make it. While Kurt worked and studied, his wife Jane accepted a scholarship to the University of Chicago to study Russian literature. She'd eventually dropped out when she became pregnant with the couple's first child, Mark Vonnegut, born May 11th, 1947. Like his wife, Kurt didn't leave university with a degree. While he did complete the undergraduate education portion of his degree, he didn't write a dissertation, after all of his ideas were rejected for being too edgy, artistic, and overambitious in scope. Kurt Vonnegut's time post-university was spent trying to find his place in the world, while his wife pushed him towards a career as a writer. There were moments when he found himself with jobs that weren't making the best use of his talents. His first stint as a writer outside of university was for General Electric, where his brother Bernard worked as a scientist. Kurt worked as a technical writer and later on as a publicist in 1947, but during this time, Jane continued to persuade her husband to use the gift he'd been given. We're just lucky he eventually listened. In 1949, the couple welcomed their second child, Edith Vonnegut, into the world. It was around this time that Vonnegut started seeing success with his short stories, starting in 1950 when his short story, Report on the Barnhouse Effect, was published in Collier's Magazine's February 11th issue. He earned $750 for his efforts. Not long after that, he sold another story for $950. After being coached by Knox Berger, the Collier's editor who saw the talent in Kurt, he decided to make a change. So to Berger's horror, he quit his steady-paying job at GE and moved with his wife and kids to Cape Cod, Massachusetts. With this move, Vonnegut intended to take his wife's advice and Knox Berger's guidance and become a full-time writer. In the late 1940s, Kurt was in a good position to become a writer after Berger had gotten literary agent Kit Littauer in Vonnegut's corner. It was highly possible he could actually make Kurt a properly published writer. In 1951, he made his first step towards that goal when he optioned Vonnegut's first novel, Player Piano, to Scribner's. It wasn't the kind of money he'd been earning at GE, but it was a start for a new writer like Kurt, who'd only had success with short stories so far. And like a lot of writers with their first published novel, it gave Kurt a sense of legitimacy. The novel was published in 1952 and followed a post-Third War world in which factory workers have all been replaced by machines, influenced by Vonnegut's time working at General Electric, of all things. Through it all, Jane remained steadfast in her belief that her husband was meant to be a writer, and Kurt made good on her beliefs because now he was one. The question was, could he keep it up? Player Piano proved to be a minor success for the first-time author, but that wasn't a deterrent for him to throw in the towel. His early use of signature techniques such as dark comedy, dystopian settings, and satire would all be honed with every novel he crafted. Reviews for the book were fairly positive, if not a bit tepid, with one reviewer stating, "What Mr. Vonnegut lacks in fervor, he more than makes up in fun." Following Player Piano, Vonnegut returned to selling short stories to numerous magazines to supplement his income in the meantime. At the same time, he worked on a second book, which he'd already been contracted to write. The book would eventually become Cat's Cradle. Cat's Cradle proved challenging for Kurt to complete, having languished for years while Kurt produced more short stories in the interim. In 1954, during the writing of Cat's Cradle, he and Jane had their third child, Nanette Vonnegut. The need for success was growing. While his earnings from short stories helped pay the bills and keep the family afloat, they weren't the same as the earnings a successful book might be able to bring through. In 1957, Kurt and Jane opened a SAAB automobile dealership close to his home on Cape Cod, but that went bankrupt by the end of the same year. Things only got more complicated when Kurt's sister died in 1958, just days after her husband was killed in a train accident. The couple had 4 children who stayed with Kurt and his family for a year before being given to a parental relative in Georgia. By now, Kurt had moved on from attempting to finish Cat's Cradle. Instead, he published The Sirens of Titan in 1959, which followed a Martian invasion and a billionaire. For reviewers, this was a strange book. They didn't really know what to think of it, resulting in somewhat mixed reviews and a lack of impression on the market. which was a fate his next novel in 1962, Mother's Night, also received. It was the publication of Cat's Cradle that really started changing Vonnegut's fate. After years of attempting to complete the novel, it finally made its way to bookshelves in 1963, receiving a much more positive reception than his previous works had received. He'd have one more book and a crisis of faith before he achieved true success, though. Still, it was on the horizon for Vonnegut, who, following his novel God Bless You, Mr. Rosewater, would write the book that defined his career, Slaughterhouse-Five. The mid-1960s leading up to the publication of Slaughterhouse-Five was a mentally challenging time for Vonnegut. He contemplating abandoning his career as a writer after going broke by 1965, having a large family to provide for, and finding little success with his books and plays. His writing career just seemed to be floundering. Instead, an admirer saved him by offering a full-time job teaching writing at the Iowa Writers' Workshop in 1965 and 1966. Following his time teaching at the Iowa Writers' Workshop, Vonnegut was awarded a Guggenheim Fellowship in Germany in 1967. He traveled in Eastern Europe, even stopping in Dresden, where he'd been a POW many years prior. The time spent here impacted Kurt Vonnegut, as he saw buildings still destroyed from the war decades prior, and as a result, this trip became the foundation of his next novel, Slaughterhouse-Five. From this trip, he came closer than ever to the aftermath he'd likely never considered of the attacks on Dresden. While Vonnegut had been writing about his war experiences for years to no avail, the trip back to Dresden had unlocked something in him. It brought forth a story worth telling, and for publishers, a story worth publishing. Maybe Vonnegut's success was merely the timing of it all, but that didn't change the success of it all. Vonnegut's publishing of Slaughterhouse-Five was when anti-war sentiment was at an all-time high, with younger generations denouncing the Vietnam War. This audience resonated with Vonnegut's book, and as a result, it shot to the New York Times bestseller list with ease, and catapulted Vonnegut to success as a writer. Little did Kurt know that behind the success he experienced would come a host of personal struggles to keep him firmly grounded to earth in the coming years. The level of success Vonnegut found following the publication of Slaughterhouse-Five was an entirely new feeling for the author, who'd already published several novels by this point. He was considered a hero in the growing anti-war movement in the US, and was invited to speak at rallies and demonstrations for years following the release of Slaughterhouse-Five. He was also invited to numerous colleges to give commencement addresses. In 1970, he went on to lecture at Harvard. In 1972, Slaughterhouse-Five was adapted into a movie, adding another success to his name. For the 1973 to 1974 academic year, Vonnegut taught writing at City College of New York. It didn't end there, though, because he'd go on to be elected vice president of the National Institute of Arts and Letters and be given honorary degrees by several universities. Vonnegut was riding high, and taking on the newfound fame seemed almost effortless to him. While Vonnegut's career was going extremely well, his personal life suffered on numerous fronts. Vonnegut was a known atheist, so when his wife began embracing Christianity, it led to the two finding themselves constantly fighting. Newly empty nesters, they'd never been alone together for long stretches, and with the growing divide over religion, things continued to deteriorate between them. Eventually, the couple split, with Kurt moving to New York in 1971 and divorcing later that year. The two remained friends until she passed away in 1986. Tragedy came quick after Vonnegut's divorce, when Kurt's first child, Mark, suffered a mental breakdown in 1972. This led to a furthering of Kurt's own depression and led to him taking Ritalin, which he would only stop taking in the mid-1970s after seeking help from a psychologist. With the success of Slaughterhouse-Five still alive, albeit not as front of mind, Vonnegut sought to get to work on his next novel. Still, the various issues in his personal life didn't make that an easy endeavor. When it comes to Breakfast of Champions, Kurt actually began writing the book before 1970, but slow progress caused him to abandon the book in 1970. Eventually, in 1973, it finally made its way to shelves. Unlike his last book, Slaughterhouse-Five, this one was met with negative reviews, a fate his 1976 novel, Slapstick, also faced. Kurt Vonnegut wasn't immune to the critical feedback his novels received, which impacted him negatively, of course. But with everything happening in his life, it was clear he was a person in crisis, a writer in freefall. Things began to turn around for Vonnegut eventually after meeting and falling in love with photographer Jill Kremens in the early 70s. He eventually married her in 1979. Together, the two adopted a baby girl named Lily, who was just 3 days old. It seemed like Vonnegut's life was back on track and just in time because he was about to experience a resurgence in popularity. Vonnegut's final years were enjoyed by a resurgence in popularity and enthusiasm for his work. His past two failures had come and gone. Now he was back to producing work that was getting more positive attention, with titles like Jailbird in 1979, Dead-Eye Dick in 1982, Bluebeard in 1987, and Hocus Pocus in 1990. Along the way, he published short story collections and plays. In 1997, he published his final novel, Timequake. In 2005, Kurt Vonnegut published A Man Without a Country, a collection of essays and a work as close to autobiographical as the author ever truly got. The book became a critical and commercial success, achieving bestseller status. Not that anyone knew it then, but this hit book would be his last, as the time had come for Kurt Vonnegut's final chapter. On April 11, 2007, at age 84, Kurt Vonnegut died at his home in Manhattan after succumbing to brain injuries he sustained from a fall down the stairs, which occurred several weeks prior in his brownstone home. With his passing, the outpouring of love and admiration for the writer began almost immediately after his wife Jane announced the author's death. The life, career, and legacy of Kurt Vonnegut are by no means straightforward. The man behind the pages suffered a great deal of inner turmoil and loud voices that sometimes complicated his very existence. His work was often overlooked and underappreciated in its time beyond the obvious success of Slaughterhouse-Five. But by the time of his death in 2007, he'd left an indelible mark on American literature with 14 novels, 5 plays, 3 short story collections, and 5 non-fiction books. Vonnegut's writing was that of a man trying to comprehend and explain to himself a forever-changing world while facing his own mortality and demons. In the 21st century, much of what Vonnegut wrote echoes through the present as the world continues to change more rapidly every day. Vonnegut wasn't writing the future, nor was he one to predict it. Like so many, he was trying to make sense of the nonsensical, and maybe that's why he found such a resonance in the hearts and minds of millions worldwide. That's all a writer ever dreams of achieving, isn't it? So I hope you enjoyed this video and found it as entertaining and informative as I have. Big thanks to James CJ for the fantastic script, and be sure to follow him if he's provided social media links to us. Links to my books, my channels, and socials are there as well, if you are so inclined. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time, Space Cowboy.